Welcome back, everybody, to another deep dive. Today, we are going to be tackling, well, a pretty big one, empires. You know those massive historical forces that kind of shape the world? We're going to explore how they rise, how they fall,
Yeah.
and what it all means for you as an investor in today's world.
Sounds fascinating.
It is. Our main source for this deep dive is going to be Ray Dalio's Principles for Dealing with the Changing World Order. It is a book that is packed with insights. We're going to try to break it down into bite-sized pieces you can actually use.
I like bite-sized.
Who doesn't?
I think one of the things that is so interesting about Dalio's work is that he identifies these recurring patterns in history. He calls them cycles that empires seem to go through. And it's not about like predicting the exact year a nation will rise or fall. It's more about understanding the forces at play.
Okay, so let's unpack this big cycle idea. Dalio says empires have been rising and falling in these cycles for the past 500 years. Is it really that predictable? What makes these cycles tick?
Well, it's not like clockwork, but there are some common threads. Imagine like a pendulum swinging between periods of peace and prosperity, where you know things are generally good, innovation is flourishing, and then periods of turmoil, economic downturns, social unrest, even wars. These shifts are usually driven by changes in the balance of power. You know, who's on top, who's challenging the status quo.
So it's like a constant push and pull for dominance on the world stage.
Yeah.
But how do we even measure, who's winning this global game of power? What makes an empire powerful in the first place?
So Dalio breaks it down into 8 key indicators. Things like education levels, innovation, how productive their economy is, how much influence they have in global trade, military strength, the power of their financial sector, and even how widely their currency is used around the world.
So basically, the more boxes you tick, the stronger your position. It's like a scorecard for empires.
Exactly. And by looking at how these indicators are trending for a particular nation, we can get a sense of whether they're on the rise or heading towards decline.
And here's where it gets really interesting. Dalio argues that the seeds of an empire's decline are often sown from within. It's not always about being conquered from the outside. It's about internal weaknesses that make them vulnerable.
Right. Think about the Roman Empire, for example. It wasn't just barbarians at the gates that brought them down. It was also internal decay, decadence, inequality, and a loss of social cohesion. Those internal cracks made them much easier to topple.
And Dalio doesn't shy away from drawing parallels to the modern American empire. He paints a pretty stark picture in the book. Consumerism run amok, record debt, political divisions tearing the country apart. It's a little unsettling to see those historical patterns potentially playing out today.
The point isn't to be alarmist, but to be aware of the potential pitfalls. History can be a powerful guide, not just for understanding the past, but for navigating the present.
So let's connect this to the listener. Why should you care about these grand cycles of history? It all feels very big picture. But how does it actually impact you?
Well, for starters, we are living through one of these cycles right now. The global landscape is shifting dramatically, and understanding these patterns can help you adapt to the changes happening around us, whether in your career, your investments, or even just how you see the world.
Okay, so history isn't just dusty textbooks. It's a roadmap for understanding what's happening today and what might be coming next. Dalio uses some really interesting historical examples to illustrate these cycles in action. He talks about how Japan emerged as a global power in the late 19th century, and it wasn't a smooth ride.
Right, he focuses on the Meiji Restoration. After a period of intense internal conflict and being forced open to global trade, Japan underwent this incredible transformation. They modernized their economy, invested heavily in education, built up their military. They essentially rebooted their entire system to compete on the world stage.
That investment in education really stands out. Dalio points out that the U.S. followed a similar path, making huge investments in public education after the Civil War, which laid the groundwork for their economic boom in the 20th century.
It is a fascinating parallel. It seems investing in human capital, educating your workforce, fostering innovation, is a pretty solid strategy for nations looking to climb the power ladder.
Another example Dalio highlights is Britain during the Industrial Revolution. They were the undisputed superpower of that era. And it all came down to mastering those key indicators of power we talked about earlier.
Absolutely. They were at the forefront of new technologies. They controlled vast global trade routes. They had a sophisticated financial system, and their currency, the British pound, became the global reserve currency, essentially the go-to currency for international trade.
Wait, hold on. Global reserve currency. You have to break that down for me. What makes a currency so special that it becomes the global standard?
Imagine it like this. If you're doing business internationally, you need a currency that everyone trusts, a currency that's stable and widely accepted. That's what a global reserve currency is. It's like the gold standard of global finance. Having your currency in that position gives you a huge amount of influence and power.
So during the Industrial Revolution, Britain was holding all the cards. They had the technology, the trade routes, and the dominant currency. It's like they were winning at Monopoly on a global scale.
That's a great analogy. And it's interesting how Dalio draws parallels between Britain's dominance then and the role of the US dollar today. The US dollar is currently the global reserve currency, but Dalio suggests that this might not last forever.
Ooh, now that's a cliffhanger. We're going to have to unpack that in part 2. But before, I want to circle back to those 8 key indicators of power. Can you give us a few more specific examples of how those have played out in history? I'm especially curious about how they might apply to the U.S. and China today.
Yeah, for sure. So let's start with the US. They still hold a lot of those high cards, a powerful military, a leading role in tech innovation. And yeah, the US dollar is still the world's reserve currency. But Dalio argues that even these pillars of American power might not be as unshakable as they once seemed.
Okay. So even the top dog has vulnerabilities. What's Dalio seeing is making him question the long-term dominance of the U.S.?
He raises some thought-provoking questions about the sustainability of U.S. military spending. Can they keep throwing money at defense indefinitely? He also points to the potential for other currencies, like the Chinese yuan, to challenge the dollar's dominance. And let's not forget those internal challenges the U.S. is facing. The political polarization, the social unrest, all those things can chip away at a nation's strength over time.
So it's not just about external threats. It's about whether a nation can keep its own house in order.
Exactly. Now let's shift gears and look at China through the lens of these 8 indicators. What's remarkable is the sheer speed of China's economic growth. Over the past few decades, back in 2003, they accounted for just 4% of global GDP. Fast forward to 2023, and that number has surged to 18%. That kind of rapid ascent is unprecedented in modern history.
That is a huge jump. And they're not just growing domestically. Dalio highlights how China is making strategic moves globally, like their massive investments in infrastructure projects through the Belt and Road Initiative, which spans over 140 countries.
Yeah, those investments are about more than just building roads and bridges. They're about expanding China's economic and political influence around the world. They're playing the long game, and that's something investors need to pay attention to.
It's like they're building their own network of alliances and partnerships, securing their place in the global supply chain. Dalio also points out that China is rapidly catching up in areas like technology, challenging the U.S.'s dominance in fields like 5G and artificial intelligence.
Yeah. And they're doing it through a very different model. They're leveraging their centralized system to direct resources into strategic sectors. And it's paying off in terms of technological advancements. Think of companies like Huawei, which are becoming major players on the global tech scene.
So China is clearly a force to be reckoned with. But Dalio's book doesn't just paint a rosy picture of their rise. He also points out some potential challenges they face.
Right. One of the biggest hurdles for China is its aging population, a consequence of their one-child policy. This demographic shift could put a strain on their economic growth in the coming years. They'll have a smaller workforce to support a larger elderly population.
Yeah, that's a significant headwind.
Yeah.
Are there any other vulnerabilities Dalio highlights?
He also points out that China's tightly controlled political system could stifle innovation in the long run. While their top-down approach can be effective in the short term, it might not foster the kind of freewheeling creativity and entrepreneurial spirit that drives long-term economic dynamism.
That's a fascinating tension, the balance between control and freedom, and how that plays out in terms of economic and technological progress. Dalio also talks about the environmental challenges China faces. They are the world's largest emitter of CO2, and that's a significant issue, not just for China, but for the entire planet.
Absolutely. As China's economy continues to grow, they'll need to find ways to decouple that growth from carbon emissions.
It's a challenge, but it's also an opportunity for innovation and leadership in clean energy technologies.
Okay, so we've got this complex picture emerging. The U.S. still powerful, but showing signs of decline. China on the rise, but with its own set of challenges. It's like watching a game of chess, where both sides have strengths and weaknesses. And for investors, it's about trying to understand how these pieces might move on the board and position yourself accordingly.
So let's bring it back to the listener. What does this global power shift mean for their portfolio? How do we make sense of all this and turn it into actionable investment strategies?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? It's about having a framework for thinking about these complex issues and making informed decisions.
Okay, so no crystal ball, just a good set of tools to navigate this changing world. What are some of the key takeaways from Dalio's book that investors can actually use?
One of the biggest lessons is that adaptability is key. The world is changing rapidly, and clinging to old assumptions could be costly.
Yeah, he uses this great analogy of a ship navigating stormy seas. To stay afloat, you need to be aware of the winds and currents, adjust your sails, and sometimes even change course altogether.
Yeah, it's a powerful metaphor for how we should approach investing and life in general. Don't be afraid to challenge your assumptions. Embrace new information and be willing to pivot when necessary.
So how does this be adaptable mantra translate into concrete investment advice? What are some things investors should be thinking about? What advice does Dalio actually give?
Well, one of his core principles is diversification. So instead of putting all your eggs in one basket, he encourages you to think about your portfolio as a collection of assets that are designed to weather different kinds of economic storms.
Oh, so it's about spreading your risk, not just across different stocks or bonds, but across like different asset classes altogether.
Exactly. He talks about things like real estate, commodities, things like gold or oil, even cryptocurrencies, as potential hedges against inflation or economic uncertainty. Each asset class has its own characteristics, and they respond differently to changes in the global landscape.
I see. I'm starting to see how this adaptability ties into like actual portfolio construction. It's like building a team with different players who have unique strengths and weaknesses, so you're prepared for whatever the game throws at you.
That's a great analogy. And it's not just about picking the right assets, it's about understanding the role each asset plays in your portfolio and how it might perform under different economic conditions. This means doing your research, understanding the risks involved, and not being afraid to seek professional advice.
So it's not a set it and forget it approach. It's about being dynamic, reevaluating your strategy as the world changes.
Precisely. Another really crucial piece of advice from Dalio is to think long term. So don't get swept up in the day-to-day fluctuations of the market. Instead, focus on identifying those long-term trends we've been talking about and investing in areas that will benefit from those trends.
Like those technological shifts we discussed, like artificial intelligence, automation, clean energy. Those seem like pretty solid bets for the future.
Absolutely. But remember, there's always risk involved. Dalio emphasizes having a financial cushion, like a safety net to weather those unexpected storms. This means having an emergency fund, paying down high-interest debt, and making sure you're adequately insured.
Those sound like pretty basic personal finance tips, but I guess they take on even more importance when we're talking about navigating these potentially turbulent times.
Yeah, it's about creating a solid foundation so you can weather the ups and downs and capitalize on opportunities when they arise. And it's not just about maximizing your own financial well-being. Dalio also reminds us that we're not just investors, we're citizens of the world.
So he's saying our investment choices should reflect our values.
Exactly. This is where the concept of ethical investing comes in. You can choose to support companies that align with your values, whether that's sustainability, social justice, or corporate governance.
It's a powerful reminder that our money can be a force for good or bad.
Yeah, and I think that's a fitting note to end on. As we wrap up this deep dive, I hope you're walking away, not just with practical insights for your portfolio, but with a sense of agency, like a feeling that you can navigate these complex times and make choices that shape a better future, both for yourself and the world around you.
That's a great takeaway. This has been a fascinating exploration of Ray Dalio's principles for dealing with the changing world order. Remember, this is just a starting point. Keep learning, keep asking those tough questions, and most importantly, stay adaptable. Until next time, happy investing.